Sure. All right. Okay. So, hey everybody. I'm glad you were able to join today's webinar on the thought of Leo Strauss. Um, so, who was Leo Strauss? So, Leo Strauss was arguably one of the most important political theorists of the 20th century, especially as it relates to the history of political thought. The sub-discipline within political theory. So he's not much of an analytical political philosopher, but much more of a historian of ideas, So Strauss in the US, for example, wouldn't really warrant a big introduction, but here in Europe, he's far less studied than in the US. There's also, there seems to be a rising interest in Strauss in China as well, as far as I can tell. But in Europe, there has been far less study of Strauss academically. So there's a couple of clusters of people studying Strauss in Germany, in France, and in Italy, as far as I know. But you can definitely go through your studies of political science and political theory without ever having stumbled upon Leo Strauss in the European context. So this is kind of the idea about today's webinar. Is just to introduce you to the thought of Leo Strauss and just sort of put it out there that he could be important or interesting to you. All right. So historically speaking, who was Leo Strauss? So Leo Strauss was part of the generation of philosophers who studied during the Weimar Republic in Germany, such as Hannah Arendt or Eric Voegelin, for example. And he was a Jew, and he was fleeing persecution from Germany, first to Great Britain and then to the United States. And so he's part of this whole sort of German emigre philosophical culture that was later established in the US. And he was very much influenced, as were so many philosophers of this day, by both, on the one hand, Husserl and sort of general phenomenology, and on the other side, Heidegger, but also politically speaking, to a lesser extent, by the thinking of Carl Schmitt. So the main sort of historical sense of this time was the time of acute crisis, right? So this is something that we can definitely see in Voegelin and in Arendt, for example, having witnessed and having seen the collapse of Germany, which at that time was pretty much, at the height of sort of intellectual development. If you think about, all the big philosophers at the time teaching in Germany, think of Husserl, think of Heidegger, for example, think of Schmitt, and nonetheless, the Weimar Republic, the liberalism of the Weimar Republic couldn't sort of sustain itself and was in acute crisis and was sort of crushed between, fascism on the one side and Bolshevism on the other side. And that is sort of the real sense of crisis that a lot of these philosophers faced in their own time, and that they sort of tried to grapple with. And what all of these philosophers interestingly did was they tried to come to terms with the crisis of liberalism by going back, by trying to spot a very moment in the history of philosophy where this crisis sort of took off, where in the history of political philosophy, we sort of took a wrong turn. And interestingly enough, both Leo Strauss and Hannah Arendt go back to Machiavelli and Hobbes, so does Eric Voegelin. So there's a lot of interesting commonalities between these three thinkers. And they all of these three thinkers happen to have, teach most of their life in the US, and so they had a lot of influence on the development of political theory in the US, but to a lesser extent in Europe. So what I'm going to try to do today is to introduce you to the thought of Leo Strauss, in particular as it concerns the implications of his thoughts for political theory. So first, I'm going to talk about Strauss the philosopher and Strauss the interpreter, what the difference is. I'm going to talk about the crisis of political philosophy, positivism, and historicism. Then I'm going to be talking about the rediscovery of the art of writing. This is probably what Leo Strauss is most famous for. And then I'm going to briefly talk about reasons why one would practice the art of writing. And then I'm going to conclude by drawing out sort of certain implications for the study of the history of political thought and political theory in general. And then I hope we still have time for a critique of Strauss and Strauss's methodology. Okay, so Strauss the philosopher, Strauss the interpreter. So today I'm going to talk about, mainly going to talk about Strauss the scholar. So as you may know, Strauss was a great scholar of canonical and also less canonical texts in the history of political thought. So for example, less canonical texts. So he studied Plato and Aristotle, Hobbes, you know, the very obvious canonical thinkers in the history of political thought. But he also had a peculiar obsession with, for example, medieval Platonic thinking in the Arabic Enlightenment. So think of Al-Farabi, Maimonides, you know, Avicenna, etc. You know. And he also had a particular interest in a thinker that today we don't even really recognize as a philosopher anymore, which is Xenophon. But I'm going to try to show you that this also makes perfect sense in you know, in the light of what he's trying to achieve in his sort of philosophical project. Okay, so, but he was first and foremost an interpreter of great books of the Western canon. But he was not only a mere interpreter of texts, but also a philosopher himself. But he didn't really write philosophical treatises in which he stated his own philosophy, but rather, you know, through the totality of his interpretive writings on texts and political thought, you can sort of, you know, his own philosophical convictions sort of crystallize. So he's very hard to pin down when it comes to his own sort of quote unquote philosophy, you know. So this is another reason why I'm going to focus on Leo Strauss, the scholar, and not so much Leo Strauss, the philosopher. Nonetheless, it is one has going to, you know, you have to say that trying to separate these two sides of his thinking is ultimately impossible, really, because they're so closely connected, if not ultimately one and the same, for in the case of Leo Strauss. So, you know, his philosophical side can really not be, you know, separated from his being an interpreter of political thought. And this is because I think the core of his philosophy is the idea of the philosophical life as the best life, as the sort of noblest possible human life, you know, the supreme human activity in this sort of ancient Greek sense. You know, think about Plato and Aristotle. I mean, you're familiar with Plato and Aristotle discussing the best life, the virtues, etc., and distinguishing between the philosophical life and the political life, between the various virtues, you know, like the intellectual virtues, etc. And they kind of like established a hierarchy of different forms of life and virtues. And so Strauss, I think, would follow Plato in thinking that the philosophical life, the philosophical activity itself, is the highest and sort of most, the noblest form of being for humans. And that is why ultimately I don't really think that you can distinguish between Strauss the scholar and Strauss the philosopher, because the core of his philosophy, I think, is about exactly the sort of philosophical activity itself in a sort of synthetic sense, not as in sort of philosophy as doctrine X or Y, but rather the skeptical questioning activity itself. And the main modern manifestation of the philosophy, of the sort of philosophical activity, is the interpretation of great texts, and perhaps to a lesser degree also talking and discussing philosophy, perhaps with friends. You know, also think about Aristotle and Plato and the great importance they put on friendship also in the philosophical education. So philosophy not only meaning sort of dwelling in your own sort of apartment and being isolated as a philosopher and sort of contemplation as a sort of very isolating task, but it's also about, you know, communicating about philosophy and talking about philosophy to others. And this is precisely why Strauss the scholar and Strauss the philosopher are ultimately one and the same, right? Because interpretation is the supreme modern manifestation of philosophizing. So they kind of fall together, you know, in his own sort of philosophy. So, but the activity of political philosophy he saw as being in great danger in his own time, right? Again, bear in mind there's this great sort of historical sense of crises, you know, because he writes in the 1930s and the 1940s, you know, mainly from a Jewish perspective, you know, from the perspective of a Jewish emigre in the US. So this great crisis of political philosophy in his own time, as he recounts it, came from two main challenges to political philosophy, you know, two modern challenges, and that were, in his mind, historicism and positivism. So he was focused very much on restoring genuine political philosophy and the very possibility of political philosophy. And so in his fashion, he was a very ardent critic of both positivism and historicism. And he ultimately thought that positivism and historicism sort of ultimately made political philosophy impossible. So what is positivism, right? So positivism has a couple of sort of axioms. One of that being that positivism maintains, on the one hand, that modern science is the model for all knowledge, for all human knowledge. And think of, again, this is also very much in holding with the times, you know, back then, you know, think of Husserl and the advent of phenomenology, think of Heidegger, etc. You know, so there was a great deal of critique of natural science going on and positivism at that time. And on the other hand, another axiom of positivism is that there's a fundamental difference between facts and values. Again, think of Max Weber, for example. And it is problematic to political philosophy precisely because it holds it kind of holds that knowledge of values is ultimately unattainable. So in a political science context, for example, the role of political science would be, in a positivistic sense, to mimic the methodology of the natural sciences as closely as possible and to confine itself to the empirical study of, for example, say, voter behavior or decision-making processes in political institutions, etc. You know, but this view is very much obviously incoherent for many reasons. One such reason being that positivists talking about human behavior would have to put, you know, terms such as criminal, etc., you know, also terms that carry some sort of normative content in question marks, right? Because saying that an act is bad requires you to judge it against a normative standard, and that would constitute a value judgment in itself, you know. So as a political scientist, you wouldn't really be able to say that liberal democracy is superior to fascism, because that would also require you to make a value judgment. And so finally, following the positivist logic, the positivist commitment to the scientific method is no less a value than a commitment to, say, a certain religion. So the mere interest of the scientist in scientific inquiry is a value. So if no value can be said to be truer than any other, then our mere orientation towards science and the methodology of science cannot be said to be better than any other form of human inquiry, you know. Say astrology, for example, you know. So the way forward for positivism, because of this logical fallacy, has been in Leo Strauss's mind the transformation of positivism into historicism, by claiming that our valuing of the scientific method is historically prefigured. So in the history of mankind, science is but one form of inquiry, but it is the current one, the one of our own sort of, say, time and place, you know, the one that we simply ended up with in a sort of progressive historical narrative. And in political science, this would mean a sort of acceptance of the normative status quo and an acceptance of a sort of cultural relativism. So positivism has a tendency of turning into historicism. And so this leads us to what Leo Strauss would see as the real danger to, or sort of the more acute danger to political theory, to the task of political philosophy, and that is historicism. Now, as I said, historicism is the bigger challenge that Strauss focuses much attention on. And he, in particular, addresses Heidegger's historicism. So, according to Strauss, radical historicism is the view that all thought is historically conditioned and limited. But again, he observes that this view is self-contradictory in the end, because the truth of the claim that all thought is historically limited is not restricted to time and place, right? So if the truth claim about the historical relativity of all knowledge is itself relative, it can't be true. Now, this is where sort of Heidegger comes in, because Heidegger is trying to save historicism from this pretty obvious fallacy, and Heidegger comes to the rescue of historicism by claiming that indeed all thought is historically relative, but that this insight is only available to people living at this very time, this very moment in time. So the insight itself wasn't available before, but rather is sort of relative to his own time, that being the time of Heidegger. And therefore the truth claim can indeed be relative, right? And so thereby he evades the contradiction of historicism. But this argument, on the other hand, is in need of sort of philosophical justification. So obvious questions that are raised by this argument would be, why should this insight only have been sort of available now and not like 200 years ago? So basically what Heidegger needs to give in order to justify this statement is a sort of genesis of the history of philosophy, right? So what I'm going to try to do now is summarize Heidegger's argument as best as I can, because it is very important for Leo Strauss's own thought, because Leo Strauss tries to sort of come up with a forceful counter-argument against Heidegger's historicism. And bear in mind, again, this also is very much historically relevant at the time, because Heidegger, as we probably all know, has been, a sort of had a very murky connection to National Socialism, and was very much sort of not only a bystander, but also a key sort of actor in the intellectual establishment during the Nazi time in Germany. And Heidegger sort of also betrayed a lot of his best students who were Jewish. Think of, for example, Heidegger's relation to Hannah Arendt, etc. So this was of premier importance to Leo Strauss. But bear in mind that I'm a sort of a mere political scientist, and that I'm a little light on Heidegger, to be honest, because I find Heidegger to be supremely difficult, especially if you don't have a philosophical education, but you come from a political science background. I think Heidegger is really difficult to understand and to really grasp. So bear with me, Okay, so basically, Strauss summarizes Heidegger's historicism as follows, and I'm going to quote this. All knowledge, however limited and scientific, presupposes a frame of reference or horizon within which understanding and knowing take place. Only such a comprehensive vision makes possible any observation or orientation. The comprehensive view of the whole cannot be validated by reasoning, since it is the basis of all reasoning. Accordingly, there is a variety of such comprehensive views, each as legitimate as any other. Strictly speaking, we cannot choose among different views. A single comprehensive view is imposed on us by fate. And just one observation, I think it really comes through clearly here why Heidegger would come to have such a problematic relationship with National Socialism. So according to Heidegger, no one controls the time or place at which he or she is born. but nevertheless we are free either to sort of choose in anguish the world view and standards imposed on us by fate, or to lose ourselves in illusory security or despair, you know, as he says it. So we can't really break free from our historical horizon, but we can accept it, and that's the key point. You know, you're not able to transcend the historical horizon, but you can sort of learn to accept it. So for Heidegger, historicism is a sort of, you know, comes down to a sort of self-awareness. Historicism was developed by philosophers trying to make our understanding of human life consistent with a modern sort of natural scientific view of the universe. But this very historicism has showed that natural science is itself a human activity that is you know, ultimately normative, right? It is sort of shot through with human subjectivity, with, you know, so even the scientist is prone to subjectivity. AKA it's also historically relative, right? So neither history nor science can show why human being should persist in a search of knowledge. So that's the whole, you know, sort of historical genesis that Heidegger is now giving, right? So we're at this very point where history nor science can show why human beings should persist in a search for knowledge that does not result in knowledge, strictly speaking, you know. So Heidegger's is a sort of progressive account of the history of philosophy or knowledge itself, you know. So humans throughout the centuries have progressed in their understanding. And I'm going to try to spare you the whole historical narrative of Heidegger's, but finally, in this sort of, you know, vast, you know, historical narrative of the history of philosophy that starts with the Greeks, he finally arrives at the moderns, claiming that in modern philosophy, the search for knowledge had been justified by promises of beneficent effects on human life. You know, think of, you know, Bacon and Thomas Hobbes, you know, etc. You know, so all the optimism about, you know, the future of modern philosophy as opposed to, you know, the dark, dim philosophy of Aristotle, Catholicism, Plato, etc. You know, so there was this progressive stance in modern philosophy. Yet in the 20th century, you know, the threat of, for example, nuclear war, etc., had made the beneficence of science increasingly questionable, right? So the foundational questions about the truth claim of science wasn't answered, right? But it could be postponed as long as science works to the obvious benefit of humankind. But now that this has been called into question, historicism has sort of arisen historically, and has to be the horizon with which we sort of have to embrace, because it is the only one we have at our disposal. And so this is sort of the broad sketch of what Heidegger is trying to say here, you know. So historicism has arisen. So he's not trying to argue sort of analytically, you know, like you would do in analytical political philosophy, that, oh yeah, there's like reason X, Y, Z, you know, to believe in proposition A, but rather he is giving a historical narrative why, you know, the history of philosophy ultimately points at this very moment in time, you know, that being Heidegger's moment in time, to historicism, right? And so that is also the point where Strauss sort of departs from Heidegger. And this is a key insight into why Strauss studied the history of political ideas. So he did not only study the history of political ideas for sort of antiquarian reasons, but also because he wanted to give a counter argument to Heidegger's historicism, and, you know, the full danger of historicism as he saw it unfold in Nazi Germany, for example. And so Strauss, on the other hand, proposes a different reading of the history of philosophy. So he basically agreed with Heidegger that human understanding requires a limited framework, right? So a sort of historical framework. But we cannot come to know anything if we're not able to determine the limits of this particular world in which we find ourselves. So Up to this point, he completely agrees with Heidegger. But unlike Heidegger, Strauss, though, through a reading of Plato's Republic, came to the conclusion that the framework was not provided by time, as in Heidegger's sort of progressive reading of the history of philosophy and of human knowledge, but rather by the city. So by city, Strauss means the regime in which one grows up, right? So for Strauss, city comes to mean the sort of ancient Greek term of polis, right? So he means city in this sort of Greek term of polis, which is just more encompassing than just the modern translation of state. For Strauss, the city in this ancient sense means the regime, you know, the accepted norms and values, the accepted religion, or in the case of Athens, you know, the gods of the city. And he argues that human beings come to understand the transpolitical, as in philosophical questions about the whole, only by seeing the very limits of political life. So he argues that the limits of the city make us aware not merely of something that lies beyond them, but makes us also aware that there is something good in itself. So what he's talking about is the classical Greek ascension of knowledge, right? So if you think about Plato, think about Plato's Symposium, right? There's this sort of story of ascension towards, you know, the ideas, you know, sort of as a sort of erotic, in Plato, they called it erotic ladder towards philosophy, right? So this ascension from the political to the philosophical, and the philosophical being higher than the political. So Strauss argues politics necessarily raises philosophical questions about the whole, because all political action is necessarily directed, right? Think of the nature of action. You know, action is always directed towards something. And so Strauss says we either wish to preserve a current political constellation or we wish to change it. But directed action, you know, either preserving or changing, always presupposes some thought of better or worse, right? And I wish to preserve, for example, I wish to preserve something so in order for it not to become worse, or I wish to change something so that it becomes better. So the conception of the good that guides our actions has the character of opinion first and foremost, you know, in the city, which upon reflection turns out to be questionable. So the very fact that we can question our conception of the good, which leads our actions and directs them, you know, towards a thought of the good that is no longer questionable. So Strauss thinks that all political action has in itself a sort of directedness towards knowledge of the good. This pursuit can be characterized as political philosophy ultimately for Leo Strauss. And political philosophy, on the other hand, raises the question about what philosophy is, right? And that is ultimately knowledge of the whole. And since we don't have knowledge of the whole, you know, very obviously, you know, philosophy has been laboring on this question for 2,500 years, you know. It is not knowledge of the whole as in concrete doctrine, but rather it is sort of the pursuit of knowledge of the whole, you know, the pursuit of wisdom. And that is literally also what philosophy means. So against Heidegger, Strauss argues that history seems to prove that all human thought is concerned with the same perennial questions that arise naturally out of politics. So, for example, what is the whole? What is the good? How should I act, etc.? You know, these are questions that always arise, and they arise in every sort of historical constellation, and not just at some point in time. You know. And this is due to the very nature of political action. So the very nature of political action sort of provokes these questions. So summing it up, he kind of agrees with Heidegger on the necessity of a horizon, a sort of a limited framework, which limits we have to come to understand in order to truly know something. But unlike Heidegger, he thinks this horizon is not time, but the city, aka politics. Okay, I skipped this. All right, and so this is where Leo Strauss's rediscovery of the art of writing comes in, right? So this is what Leo Strauss is probably most well known for, right? We all know him as, or most people, at least in the US, for example, would know him as this the philosopher who is talking about sort of secret teachings in texts, etc. And of course, wherever you hear about secret teachings and esotericism and exotericism, that always invites a lot of interest and suspicion also. So the argument that I just gave was Strauss's philosophical argument against historicism, but now comes another argument against historicism, but also in favor of transhistoricism, which is the method of interpretation that he ultimately sort of embraces, and the way he thinks we should approach political theory and the history of political thought ultimately. All right, so if you happen to have nodded off while I was talking about Heidegger and historicism, and now is the time to sort of tune back in, because this is really where push comes to shove for our way of understanding political theory. These are the real implications of Strauss's counter narrative to Heidegger. So we can clearly see now why Strauss studied the history of political philosophy, right? Because he wanted to show empirically that the idea of historicism, that all thought is historically relative, is incorrect. So the key insight of Leo Strauss is, as I said, the art of writing. So that is the distinction between esoteric and exoteric writing, which Strauss is so famous for, right? So it is the idea that in a written document, there can sometimes be sort of a surface that corresponds largely to the orthodoxies of the current day, aka the norms of the city, and hidden between the lines will be the real message of the philosopher, which he intended only for philosophers and wanted to hide from the rest, right? So now bear in mind, this has to be said, that esoteric in this sense has really nothing to do with the sort of new age spirituality and what we currently today understand as esotericism, right? So eso in Greek simply means inside, and exo in Greek simply means outside. So it is talking about the inner layer, the esoteric layer, and the outer layer of a text, that is the exoteric layer. So in this way, the text will speak differently to different audiences. A very obvious example of such exotericism can be found in Hobbes, for example, who on the surface, as we know, talks a lot about Christianity, but his sort of mechanistic philosophy is at the root is deeply atheistic. So there seems to be a contradiction in Hobbes on the one hand, because he constantly talks about Christianity and so on, and on the other hand, his philosophy, the implications of his philosophy are deeply atheistic. So this doesn't really go together, And so if you really take a text at face value, you simply see this as a sort of contradiction and, a sort of logical fallacy within Hobbes, or a sort of peculiarity, sloppy thinking on Hobbes' part, perhaps, But in the light of esoteric and exoteric distinctions within the text, it makes perfect sense. So a more, let's just bring a second example. So a more subtle example, for example, can be found in Plato, who upon reading seems to contradict himself quite a lot, right? So we probably read Plato's Republic, and sometimes he makes big leaps of faith. Sometimes he has Socrates resort to the authority of Zeus, which is very peculiar, isn't it, and very out of character for a philosopher. And Strauss would read these contradictions and all these shortcomings and fallacies of Plato, not as a sort of sloppy thinking, but as a direct hint of Plato to esoteric content in his writings, right? So an average reader would be inclined to simply read over that strange passage and just simply ignore it for the most part. But it is actually meant as a hint to more careful, philosophically inclined readers, right? And I think this sort of makes perfect sense if we, so if you happen to have studied Plato a little bit, and if you remember back at the first reading of Plato's Republic, for example, I always had a great reverence for Plato and Plato's Republic, right? And we're reading Plato we've been reading Plato for 2,500 years, but so his thought seems to be of supreme importance. He's still studied in universities and schools nowadays. But on the other hand, you come away with this sort of deep sense of disappointment when you first read Plato for the most part, because he's, especially in the Republic, he's full of contradictions and leaps of faith, and then he sort of hints at Zeus's authority, and he has Socrates of all people, the paradigmatic philosopher hint at the authority of Zeus, and nothing really seems to make a whole lot of sense, and this is very frustrating, but I think it can be resolved, and it is much more sort of insightful once you sort of try to think about this text in this sort of exoteric way, right? So the main question that now arises is, of course, why conceal certain aspects of your thought, right? Why would one do that? So I have summarized three main reasons for practicing exotericism. One being defensive exotericism, or fear of persecution, basically. So throughout most of history, obviously there was no freedom of speech. If you argued against, for example, the religious orthodoxy of your day, you could, be burned at the stake, or say, take the example of Socrates, for example, who was sentenced to death by the city of Athens, as we know, for his philosophical activity. And the very reasons that the Athenians gave for this death sentence was that he corrupted the youth and didn't believe in the gods of the city. So basically his philosophizing undermined, very deeply, in a very fundamental sense, the way of life and the norms of the city of Athens. And it was seen as very dangerous, and in fact dangerous enough for the city to sentence him to death, right? All right, so this is defensive exotericism, and then there's a second form of exotericism, and the second reason why you would employ exotericism, and that's protective exotericism, or the idea of dangerous truths. So there are two main reasons for protective exotericism. Firstly, that some truths are simply dangerous to society, right? So the activity of philosophy itself, which is sort of not the possession of knowledge, as we said, of the whole, but rather the constant ongoing search of knowledge of the whole, is a very sort of skeptical, ever ongoing activity, whereas a political regime in particular, sort of think about a pre-modern one, a pre-modern political regime, required a sort of theological basis of its power, or a strict set of norms to guide it, right? So think of the Constitution of Sparta, for example, or think of Athens, as we just mentioned it, or later in sort of the medieval period, think about the divine right of kings, etc. So philosophy as a skeptical activity is by its very nature dangerous to the city or to the political regime in which the philosopher dwells, right? So this is the first main reason for protective exotericism. The second main reason for protective exotericism is that some truths is sort of an individualistic view. The first view is more geared towards, or takes the view of the society, whereas the second one takes the view of the individual. So the second reason for practicing protective exotericism is that some truths cannot be endured by everybody, right? This sounds kind of peculiar nowadays, but it makes more sense in sort of a medieval and in an ancient setting. So think, for example, of a medieval society, for example, in which belief in God and the afterlife was widely accepted, and what would it have meant, for them to know that God doesn't exist, for example? Or in the Greek context, Plato asks, famously asks the question in the Republic, whether it is better to be just or unjust, whether being unjust has any consequences at all, etc. And he at least on the surface, he gives quite pious answers to these questions. All right, so bearing hard truths, is not for everybody. So the third and final reason for practicing exotericism is pedagogical. So in accordance with the Socratic method, you generally don't want to hand to the student, sort of a pre-formulated thesis, right? You want the student to work himself out of the cave, so to speak, in Platonic terms, right? So you don't want to be doing all the work for the student. And apart from that sort of pedagogical exotericism, it is also a chance to distinguish between possible philosophers and those who don't have such an inclination and who should not be, faced with such, dangerous ideas. So those are basically the three main reasons why writers employ the art of writing, right? And I want just quickly want to point out that there are also a lot of reasons why, exotericism now seems so strange to us nowadays. First of obviously because we are sort of the children of the Enlightenment, right? And the idea that, philosophy can be sort of popularized and that our society can be rational, fully rational, and that, we don't tend to see the gap between society and philosophy, but rather philosophy actually is supposed to improve in a way and make more rational political life, right? And another main reason why exotericism is so obscure nowadays is because in the ancient and the medieval time, you have to realize that, if you have studied classics a little bit, Latin or Greek, you know that there's this big concept of intertextuality in classics, which basically means that authors constantly hint at, previous authors, right? And they constantly sort of cite them, and this practice has become far less widespread nowadays, mainly because, there was far less writing of philosophy in the ancient and in the medieval times, So people generally knew a lot of philosophical writings, but also poems and literature. Think of Homer, for example, right? They knew them out by heart. So people actually memorized the whole content of, for example, a Homeric poem. So they were able to recite to them out by heart the complete sort of Homeric Ilias or the Odyssey, for example, something that is today very much lacking, I think you would be very, very hard pressed, to find anyone who's able to recite the Ilias or the Odyssey completely. So the sort of standards have changed in a way, and that makes, understanding exotericism much harder for us moderns than it used to be for an ancient audience or for a medieval audience. Okay, so briefly, I want to give you a couple of sort of empirical testimonies in the history of philosophy as to who practiced exotericism. So that's just not just a claim, but actually that there's a lot of empirical evidence. And there's the great work that Arthur Melzer. Oh, I forgot to put Melzer there. So there's a Philosophy Between the Lines, a terrific book by Arthur Melzer, who compiled in this book over 100 pages, and this is publicly available online. So you can have the link in the back then in the literature slide. He compiled over 100 pages worth of quotations of major philosophers saying that philosopher X, Y, or Z was practicing the art of writing, right? And he had a sort of secret doctrine, right? So the first quote is by Diderot. The ancient philosophers had a double doctrine: the one external, public or exoteric; the other internal, secret or esoteric. And this is from the Encyclopedia of Diderot, which is all the more interesting because, you know, Diderot, and especially the Encyclopedia, the very idea of the Encyclopedia of Diderot was this enlightenment idea of making, you know, all knowledge publicly available. So, you know, Diderot, you know, the premier Enlightenment philosopher would have been, you know, the least likely person, so to say, to practice esotericism himself. So another quote comes from Montaigne. Some things they, meaning the ancient philosophers, wrote for the needs of society, like their religions. And on that account, it was reasonable that they did not want the bare popular opinions to the skin, so as not to breed disorder in people's obedience to the laws and customs of their country. And a third citation I will present you, that is from Rousseau. What shall we say about the distinction between the two doctrines so eagerly received by all the philosophers, and by which they professed in secret sentiments contrary to those they taught? The philosophers were comfortable with this method, that it spread rapidly in Greece and from there in Rome. And here's a quote by Nietzsche, in typical Nietzschean fashion, I have to say. One's got to have quite a tough stomach for that one. Our highest insight must and should sound like follies and sometimes like crimes when they are heard without permission by those who are not predisposed and predestined for them. The difference between exoteric and the esoteric, formerly known to philosophers among the Indians as among the Greeks, Persians, and Muslims, in short, wherever one believed in an order of rank and not in equality and equal rights, the exoteric approach sees things from below. The esoteric looks down from above. What serves the higher type of men as nourishment or delectation must almost be poison for a very different and inferior type. There are books that have opposite values for soul and health, depending on whether the lower soul, the lower vitality, or the higher and more vigorous ones turn to them. In the former case, these books are dangerous and lead to crumbling and disintegration. In the latter, they are heralds' cries. They are heralds' cries that call the bravest to their courage. Books for all the world are always foul-smelling books. That's a quote from Beyond Good and Evil. Okay, so I think I have provided you with enough, you know, sort of empirical testimonies. And again, if you want more empirical testimonies, there's about 100 pages worth of these testimonies in Arthur Melz's book, and it is publicly available online. The link is in the slides. So, summing it up, what are the main implications for political theory? First, I think that ideas have the potential to transcend their historical horizon, right? So because philosophers through the practice of exotericism wrote both for their own historical audiences in, you know, the exoterical layer, as well as for future philosophers, you know, and this is the esoterical layer. So fundamentally, Strauss's, you know, theory is trans-historical and not historical or, you know, oriented towards historicism. Like, for example, a lot of the current schools within the methodology of political theory, think, for example, of the Cambridge School, but also think about various forms of Marxism, you know. Strauss would characterize all of these as historicist. Second, that there are certain perennial questions that arise due to the very nature of political action. Thirdly, that being a political theorist means partaking in this sort of great conversation of philosophy about untimely perennial ideas that always necessarily arise, you know, through political action itself, through the nature of political action. Fourth, philosophy is an open-ended activity that doesn't yield doctrines. Fifth, great thinkers don't commit very many mistakes. All the sort of countless contradictions in Aristotle, Plato, and Hobbes are not just them being sloppy thinkers. It's because they're communicating exoterically, which is, I think, very compelling if you have read, you know, some of the history of political thought and you have come out, you know, a little disillusionized because of all the contradictions and the supposedly great thinkers, right? Sixth, that transhistoricism as opposed to historicism in the history of ideas is appropriate, meaning that the questions of Plato, Hobbes, etc., they're largely the perennial fundamental questions of our time too. So reading these thinkers is a worthwhile thing to do, not just for sort of antiquarian reasons, but because they might still hold sort of valuable insights into the human condition, also in our present day. Seventh, esotericism provides a good solution to the problem of theory and practice in political thought. So there's, in general, in political theory, as you know, there's this big problem of theory and praxis, right? And the distinction between the city and philosophy sort of subverts this problem of theory and praxis in a really useful way. To be honest, it pretty much it tackles it really. And finally, his main message is that we should really read carefully, very carefully at that, and not take sort of blatant contradictions or appeals to religious authorities as customs, or customs at sort of face value, but rather as at hints at the esoteric layer. All right, so I think these are the main implications for political theory, and now off to a brief critique, and I hope that we can elaborate, on in our Q&A section on some of the implications of Strauss's theory. So I have come up with three main. It's not me who came up with this. These are very obvious, critiques of Strauss that have been voiced by many other philosophers. So three main ones. First off, the exoteric-esoteric distinction sort of opens you up to very murky hermeneutics, So once you sort of admit that there's multiple layers in a philosophical text, and you always have to think about the intention of the author, you can come up with all sorts of murky interpretations, and one can see this in some Strauss scholars that they really sort of go off the rails a little bit in their interpretations. And so it is just hermeneutically, generally speaking, problematic, if you're talking about the intentions of an author, or if you admit to, sort of secret layers within a text that, so you don't take the text, as it is written, at sort of face value, right? So you, in a way, you depart from the very text itself in a way, and you move towards, a supposed intention of the author, So that is one problem that is often voiced, against Straussian methodologies. A second big problem, I think, is that the esoteric-exoteric distinction is not only a sort of hermeneutical distinction, and it's simply a methodology, and it's all fair and square, right? But it also sort of carries, in the thought of Leo Strauss, it carries normative implications, So the normative implications of exotericism imply a fundamental form of human inequality that is sort of natural and that is ineradicable at the end of the day. So there will always be the distinction between the few, that is the philosophers who are in the know and who sort of are able to penetrate a certain text, and then there will be the sort of the majority that, cannot penetrate, this layer of the text because of sort of, lack of intellectual capacities and so on. So this whole conception of esotericism and exotericism, as you saw, I think, in the Nietzsche quote, is a very sort of elitist, really, it's really ultra elitist, and it's a very aristocratic conception. So it carries with itself a lot of normative baggage that we are likely not to want to accept, in our modern days. So yeah, that pretty much sums up my critique. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about Strauss, and to hear new critiques of Strauss. So yeah, that is pretty much the end of my talk, and we'd be going into the question and answers section of this webinar. All right, so is there any, are there any questions? Anything unclear? Can you think about your own critique of Strauss? Yeah.
Thank you, Gregor. I think there's a question raised by Melis. You can check the group chat.
Oh, okay. There's a question. Wait a minute. I'm trying to figure out how to access the group chat. Wait a minute. Melis, would you be able to actually voice it? I happen to have a problem with finding the commentary section here. Wait a minute.
Gregor, there's this chat button next to the share screen button. Can you see it?
Wait a minute. Chat button. No, not really, to be honest.
Oh, I think it's fine. Okay, I will
just
share Melis. Yeah, I will read on behalf of Melis. So thank you for the presentation, Gregor. The discussion on esotericism and exotericism was very interesting. I'm curious about one of your examples, exotericism in Hobbes' writing with baseline to Christianity. Can you refer us to texts from Strauss or someone else, bracket, now or from the group, bracket? Also, which of the three reasons you have provided do you think applies to his Leviathan? So two questions.
Okay, so there's definitely a work of Leo. So there's many sort of little commentaries of Leo Strauss's on Hobbes, but there's a whole book of Leo Strauss's on Hobbes, which is literally entitled On Hobbes. This is the main book of Strauss's on wherein he discusses Strauss's mostly Strauss's Leviathan, I think. So I would point you to that. As to your second question, which of the three reasons for practicing exotericism most applies to Hobbes? I would probably think that in this applies to ancient philosophy and modern philosophy, and Hobbes obviously being a modern philosopher in general. So this does not only apply to Hobbes. I think pedagogical exotericism is much less practiced, you know, the further you go down history, you know. So in the ancient times, I think pedagogical exotericism has been a big point, right, in Plato and in Aristotle. But in Hobbes, for example, I think pedagogical exotericism plays a very limited role. Also, if you think, for example, about, you know, the sort of Platonic and the Aristotelian schools, you know, in ancient Greece, you know, like they had this very sort of deep-rooted connection between life and the practice of philosophy itself. So they were much more attuned to the pedagogical needs of philosophy than the modern philosophers. And so I think the main reason for practicing exotericism for Hobbes is probably fear of persecution. So if you think about, you know, the historical period in which Hobbes wrote, you know, it was very tumultuous, right? The 30 Years' War, etc. You know, Hobbes would probably have had to face persecution if he didn't sort of espouse sort of Christian views, at least on the surface, you know. And we can see that even in his own time, there was a lot of skepticism of fellow philosophers and churchmen, you know, about Hobbes as being a Christian, right? So I think the fear of persecution is the biggest one factor for practicing exotericism for Hobbes. Another one factor that is very interesting in conjunction with Hobbes, I think that has to be mentioned is, I haven't mentioned this in my talk, but there's a fourth reason of practicing exotericism that applies to modern philosophy only. And this is that modern philosophy has deeply sort of embedded in itself this idea of human progress, right? So rationalizing the human life, right? So they're far more optimistic about reason and what reason can achieve possibly in society than the ancient writers were. And so one reason for modern philosophers, not for ancient philosophers, for practicing exotericism was that the ideas that they espouse in their writings have a lot of sort of, or gain a lot of traction in society, and they're very sort of society, so it's, well, speaking in terms of politics, they're very powerful, right? So think, for example, of the idea of contract theory in Hobbes, right? Obviously, you know, there's a million different critiques of contract theory out there, and surely Hobbes in his own time knew that you know, people weren't actually in a state of nature, right? And people didn't actually agree on, you know, establishing a sovereign, etc. You know, so this idea of contract theory, I think for Hobbes, and this is one of the arguments that Strauss presents in his own book on Hobbes, is that, you know, Hobbes created contract theory because of societal reasons, because he thought it would be very powerful within society and it would change society for the better, but that he didn't necessarily believe in its sort of full logical integrity. You know, he certainly believed that there were problems with contract theory, but nevertheless, he sort of stated it for, you know, the reasons of sort of improving society. Yeah, so I think those are the two main reasons why Hobbes would employ the art of writing. Yeah, so I hope that was somewhat helpful. Was there a second question that kind of popped up? Is there a second question or? Oh, wait a minute. Okay, I found the chat button. Sorry, you guys. Yeah, yes, so this claim about, so the question is, does it also extend this claim to the other followers of social contract theories? Yeah, so I think Strauss would definitely say that other contract theorists such as Locke, Rousseau, etc., you know, the traditional contract theorists definitely employ the social contract too in order to change society, quite frankly, and not necessarily out of simply sort of philosophical rigor. You know, I think Strauss concludes that all of these contract theorists were sort of aware that, you know, there are fundamental problems about contract theory, and that it is a huge oversimplification. But they all thought that contract theory sort of moved modern society in the right direction. That is, you know, they were all Enlightenment thinkers in a way. So that is the sort of rationalization of society, right? So I think you can definitely sort of deploy this modern reason of exotericism to the other contract theorists as well, yeah. But in generally speaking, the closer you come to our present day, of course, the less likely it is that people actually practiced esotericism for reasons of fear of persecution, obviously, you know. So fear of persecution, for example, in our own time, where we have, you know, freedom of speech, etc., doesn't make any sense anymore. So it really only applies to certain periods within the history of political thought. Yeah. All right. I hope that was of use for you.
Yeah, thank you, Gregor. Any other question from other audience? Okay, if not, I think we'll stop here today. So thank you, Gregor, again for your presentation on Leo Strauss and his practice of esotericism. So we'll come back again after 3 weeks on another topic. Thank you again for everyone for joining today. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you guys.